I'm full of it. 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 Shout out to Stormy, my rap name, don't wear it out. Shout out to Road Full of Promise / Head Full of Doubt. Shout out to Wrong Orders. Shout out to eating them, even though you ordered something else and you could speak and repent, but you might as well just eat the meal you see because it's easy and then you'll feel amazingly and you won't need to eat your meat. You always eat again, and then next time you eat it, it will taste better because it will have been longer since the last time you had it, since last time you ate that wrong order you never had before. Shout out to Sometimes Less Is More. Shout out to someone saying something. Shout out to overpowering music that plays so loud the beat's bumping. Shout out to bottled water. Actually, shout out to tap dancing because it's so full and rhythmic, and what's wrong with that? Shout out to fingers, snap. Shout out to toes as well. Shout out to condensation. Shout out to the word swelled. Shout out to the word swole. Shout out to swole on flex. Shout out to thinking ahead and putting songs in the queue to play next. Shout out to wait. Actually, this is the last song. Shout out to being wrong and accepting it. Shout out to Cheech and Trong. Shout out to Sing That Song That You Know So Well. Shout out to Adele. Shout out to Maybe It's Time. Shout out to Maybe It's Maybelline. Shout out to Maybe It's Belle. Shout out to Maybe It's Stormative. Maybe he was born to spit. Maybe he was born with it. It being the torch that's lit. Shout out to organizations who help the world, sensational people who run them, and all of their love and patience. Both meanings. Shout out to mama birds and all their feeding. Shout out to Find Your Wings and Fly and Live This Life You're Leading. Shout out to being born ugly, like me. Shout out to just randomly making up raps on a beat. Shout out to anyone who makes a rap longer than this. Shout out to being nice and not feeling the need to diss at all. Shout out to being tall, medium, short, big, average, and small. Shout out to the need to rhyme even if the words are whack. Shout out to not having to get back on track since the whole album is whack. Shout out to, my name is Waluigi and I'm tall and I'm funny and that's just me being me and here's more. Shout out to Charles Martinet for planting smiles on people's faces by making art I'll never forget. Shout out to, shout out my boy Young Popper. Shout out to Mad. Shout out to I'ma Stop There for now. Shout out to Wow. Shout out to that scene about tipping cows from cars, and well, technically the cows were really tractors and I enjoyed how that activity brought lightning and made her laughter. Shout out to Happily Ever After. Actually, never mind. Shout out to dark art that fills my heart for some reason, unkind though they are. Sometimes, I don't know, I like them. There's something about melancholy that makes me hyped to sight them or see them. Shout out to using the dash. Shout out to driving slow, homie. Shout out to sometimes driving fast. Shout out to Roderick. Shout out to #NotMy. Shout out to the guy who knows a guy who knows another guy who knows this girl who plans to take over the entire world. Even though we're just getting started and we have yet to unfurl. Shout out to Old Bay. Shout out to old women. Shout out to BAE. That's a word that has me tripping. Shout out to it. Shout out to tripping through the sheets. Shout out to rocking this party 8 days a week. Shout out to peace. Shout out to peace on earth. Shout out to giving peace a chance. It's possible for what it's worth. Shout out to birth. That's how I got here. Shout out to now. Things are starting to get a little more clear. Wow. Shout out to clearly making mistakes because of the yield benefits. Shout out to pits that don't sit but don't let people fall in. Pits that just sit but don't let people fall in because they're visible from far enough they're not a safety hazard. Shout out to masters. Shout out to experts and pros. Shout out to noses knowing roses smell like stuff between your toes. Shout out to being gross to some extent and within reason. Shout out to talking like a nerd even though being a nerd is in season. Shout out to style is infinite because it never goes out of stock. Shout out to clocks. I love those things, the ticking never stops. Shout out to cops and robbers, that little game kids play. Shout out to somewhere for someone today's their best day. Shout out to someone is also having their worst day too. Shout out to the moments when you help someone not feel so blue by making them orange. Shout out to non sequiturs. Shout out to drinking water to stop making your head hurt. Shout out to butt hurt. Shout out to exercises. Shout out to small business people who don't like enterprises. Shout out to that movie about McDonald's. Shout out to Thanos. Shout out to Doctor Strange, Thanos' Squidward guy, and trying to rhyme with Thanos. Can't though. Shout out to trying to find beauty in life even when it's hard, cause in your heart it just doesn't feel right. Shout out to Nighty Night. Shout out to making something out of nothing, mountains out of molehills, diamonds out of chump change. Shout out to my lunch gangs I sat with in junior and senior high. Shout out to guys who act nice even though acting nice doesn't yield prizes winning. Shout out to gifts that keep on giving like the sky, mine sleeping worth help feet and earning. Shout out to yearning for a particular food out of nowhere. Shout out to people who do all that stuff really cool with their hair. Shout out to Derriere. Shout out to French Club Snap. Shout out to rapping over raps with 3 snack wraps in a bag in the back. Shout out to words that I add to the track. Shout out to all of life's a movie and all we do is ever act. Shout out to Smack. Shout out to Bing Bang Pow. Shout out to Something Wong. Shout out to Bing Ding Ow. Shout out to Right Now. Shout out to It's Not Over Yet. Shout out to the songs a list that's long. Okay, a word bet. Shout out to being wet. Shout out to not staying dry. Shout out to water touching water like rain on skin from your sky. Shout out to 10 signs he loves you. Number 1, bringing gifts. Number 2, he's close to you. Number 3, I forget. Shout out to headsets. Shout out to multiplayer games. Shout out to staying up all night with your friends, rotting your brains for playing video games. Shout out to XD. Shout out to being me is easily the cheesiest way to be, but eat is leads to fiend. Shout out to okay, seriously. What is this dude on? Shout out to Nothing's Wrong, but I need to voice my opinion. Shout out to giving feedback when feedback can and should be given. Shout out to, for instance, feedback on these raps would help me out because I want to rap a lot and I need to perfect my clout because my mind is full of doubts and insecurities as I love rap, but I feel so unworthy. Shout out to ideas in my mind that try to hurt me because they give me ways to feel like I'm not dirt. Jeez. Shout out to Vsauce. Shout out to Michael. Shout out to the 3 men in a tub riding on a unicycle. Shout out to landscaping. Shout out to mispronouncing words. Shout out to birds, trees, flowers, and things. Shout out to being absurd. Shout out to absurdity. Shout out to different ways to say. Shout out to memes that aren't politically correct. Son, your mom gay. Shout out to hay. Shout out to horses who eat it. Shout out to feeding meat eaters meat even though we be vegan. Psych, nah. Shout out to cultural assimilation. JK, I don't like that. Shout out to PlayStation. Shout out to eggs and bacon. Shout out to toast. Shout out to yeeting yoted yeeter yeets their yat and yote. Shout out to Tampa Beats. Shout out to the Big Bad Wolf. Shout out to filling fools with fatty filling until they're fully full. Shout out to Pulitzer Prize winner Kendrick Lamar. Shout out to Scar. Shout out to people who don't know who they are. Shout out to shout out to Chicken Gang. Shout out to ballpoint pens. Shout out to belly dancers. Shout out to wrong answers. Shout out to long questions. Shout out to that dude who opened up that church to sell coke and Led Zeppelin. Shout out to fall. Shout out to balls. Shout out to people who get shouted out even though they did nothing at all. Shout out to the wall. Shout out to milk. Shout out to my love, Swiss cheese. Shout out to DegreeWorks for helping my homies work through the degrees. Shout out to all my teachers. Shout out to all my professors. Shout out to lions and lemurs. Shout out to leopards. Shout out to Alfred Kinsey. Shout out to chimneys. Shout out to walls, roofs, windows, doors, floors. Shout out to buildings. Shout out to what's mine is yours. Shout out to what's yours is mine. Shout out to what's mine is mine too, but only for a limited time before I turn to dust and know nothing but what's left of my mind. Shout out to theory of mind. Shout out to hearing the blind. Shout out to listening too. Shout out to Don't Touch Me. Shout out to You Can't Touch This. Shout out to kids who live life right like the way it's meant to be lived. I didn't curse on this album once. Shout out to Willie Smith. He cursed in his songs too though. You Saw My Blinker by Fresh Prince. Shout out to the dude who showed me that song, my tattoo artist Rick. Shout out to tattoo artists. Shout out to tattoo kids like me. Shout out to the fam. Shout out to the jams that I listened to growing up. Those songs made me who I am. Shout out to the shouters. Shout out to the parking lots. Shout out to that one kid who once walked around outside Walmart for 45 minutes one night just putting carts back. And shout out to that old woman who gave me her cart even though she thought me whack. Shout out to people like her who just let people be weird. Shout out to you if you're like that, and when my words you hear, you might laugh and lower your brows. But if you're tolerant of my expression, express your tolerance often to people who are left then. Nonconformists are the ones who get the lesser ends, the small piece of the wishbone, but I put my favorite nonconformists up on a big throne. Shout out to people I've met. Shout out to those I've not. Shout out to everyone who's appreciative of what they've got. Shout out to backpacks. Shout out to Frank Ocean. Shout out to Blank Media for the makers of the potions. Shout out to Espanol. Shout out to language users. Shout out to anyone who translates, transcribes, or signs so we all heard. Shout out to umbrellas. Shout out to Twitch. Shout out to anyone who knows what my true love Twitch is. Kappa Pride. Shout out to that dude. Shout out to Trihex. Shout out to people who make people laugh because laughter is the best medicine. Shout out to healthcare workers. Shout out to twerkers who twerk and work murk the nerd herders. Shout out to tweeters. Shout out to self-expression. Shout out to that inside joke, what about 7? Shout out to carrots. Shout out to farmers everywhere. Shout out to vegans. Shout out to people who stylize their hairy hair. Shout out to married pairs. Shout out to people who really listen. Shout out to children. Shout out to heroes and villains. Shout out to people who are both. Shout out to people who are thrilling. Shout out to tables and chairs. Shout out to libraries. Shout out to people on the grind, on the quiet floors. Marry me. Shout out to grass, shout out to mass, shout out to tax, not the government kind, but the one when you take a homie's fry. Shout out to ice cream men, shout out to golf wang, shout out to old thang, shout out to new thangs, but really, shout out to the present, shout out to that saying, crank it up to 11, shout out to anyone who makes anyone else feel that they're relevant, shout out to repetition, shout out to addition, subtraction, multiplication, and not division, shout out to idiots like me, shout out to people who attend concerts that are just free, shout out to Japan, shout out to Ireland, that was my first country visit, shout out to people who take deep breaths to make themselves not livid, shout out to the lamppost, shout out to Harry Crane, shout out to anyone who's very scared of scary games, shout out to The Conjuring, my first horror film, shout out to dill, shout out to pickles in general, actually. Shout out to anyone who's mad at me. I love you. Shout out to people who know they're not above anyone else. Shout out to the dumb boobs, Drake and Josh. Shout out to not stopping, even though stopping, shout out to stopping, even though stopping I am not. Shout out to contradictions. Shout out to books that are written in the style of fiction. Shout out to Pink. Shout out to Onions. Shout out to Steven Universe. Shout out to Beauty Worth Beautying. Shout out to Goonie Nerds. Shout out to Ramblers. Shout out to Jammers. Shout out to Pizza with Black Olives and Pepperoni Yammers. Shout out to anyone who's ever looked anybody else in the eye with the intention of calming them down by giving them the prize of knowing that within those who are around us there are clear sunny skies and we can all go on together prolonging on coming demise. And shout out to anyone I missed. Shout out to consensual kisses. Shout out to you. Shout out to me, because now I'm free. I find myself in all of this music, and if you're still listening, thanks. Don't let me waste any more of your time. I love you. Good luck. Go do something you love, whether or not it rhymes. Sincerely, Stormative. P.S. I was born with it. I dropped my weights like Rock Lee and found my wings like Young T. Second album, Spring 2019. If you want it to come out sooner, listen to this album a lot. Put it on repeat. Or don't. I don't care. Don't do anything I said. Just do whatever you want. Love, 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 love. Okay. Love.